Should have sound now. Check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Okay. Please like and comment questions. Cool. All right. So we should have a good stream tonight. We're going to be discussing a talk between a number of different people. Sabine Hossenfelder, Carlo Rovelli, Eric Weinstein, Brian Keating. Had a discussion on the nature of reality, and it was for I will show you, not any of their YouTube channels. Let's go to it and I'll show you the link. It is linked below though. But their talk was great, I will say. It was for the Institute of Art and Ideas. And this was originally live, and then it disappeared after it was live, and I was kind of bummed out because I missed it, and I really wanted to see it, but they re-uploaded it. So here it is. This is it right here. This is the talk that we're going to be discussing. And it's titled Quantum Physics and the End of Reality. So, a few things before we get started, while we wait for people to join. It was a bit of a slow start today for technical reasons, but seem to have got them worked out. But if you go to my website, I have recently added, and I just recently added this, so if it doesn't work well with your phone or something like that, know that I will fix it. But under writings, I have the latest abstract of the paper for sentient singularity theory that is currently being worked on, and you can read through that. I reference it a lot on these streams, so it makes sense to have it on the website. It was on the an earlier version has been on the website in the past, and these documents, both of the two documents on here, I feel like are constant works in progress. But the abstract really is, both of them are really getting there. So, but they're kind of different takes on the same thing. So this is this is an abstract of the technical paper that I'm working on. It's just the front page of the paper, which is coming soon. And then it's definitely going to be out this year, but hopefully sooner rather than later. It will definitely be out before the end of the year, but probably well before the end of the year. This right here, though, this is called The Theory of Everyone, and I've read it on here before, but I've drastically changed some things. It's kind of, I don't even know what to call it. It's not a poem, but it's not technical paper. I don't really know what it is. Once I was just compelled to write this down when I was on my way home from work, and I just knew that I was going to write this down. But it's kind of like an artistic take on the pattern of everything, or the theory of everyone, or the theory of everything. And it just talks about the various conscious types of consciousness that are created, and the pattern that they go through, and their interaction, and replication. But I think that it's good to have kind of both of these, because one of the things that I've realized is that, and a number of people have realized this, is that the ultimate truth is its ultimate beauty. And so because of that, you can't really separate artisticness, I guess. What is artistic from what is technical and true. So I kind of wanted to have both up on here. I think that it's helpful for those who can't understand this, should be able to understand this. And for those who don't understand this, maybe you'll be able to understand this. So, all right. With that, let's get into it. But yeah, take a look, sentientsingularity.com. This is the first clip of that I'm going to show now of the talk between Sabine Hossenfelder, Carlo Rovelli, Eric Weinstein, and Brian Keating. Before we get into that clip, I want to kind of give an overview of everybody on here. If you don't know them, Eric Weinstein, talk about him quite often on here, mathematician, but kind of default physicist, creator of geometric unity, which is a proposed theory of everything. Sabine Hossenfelder, physicist, makes a lot of comments about how beauty has been misleading physicists lately, and I think that that's not exactly true, but I think that it's kind of true. I think sexiness has misled physicists these days, and they think that it's beauty, but it's not beauty. But true beauty cannot mislead you in physics. But I get what she's saying, is that a lot of people talk about the beauty of physics, and they have these structures which they don't really understand in mathematics, these manifold structures, and they are beautiful, you can tell, but they're also, you can't really tell how beautiful they really are because you can't contextualize them. And the difference between sexy and beautiful is sexy is purely contextual and beauty is universal. So a song that is sexy is a song that is only sounds good in a certain context. Let's say, like, a certain person is singing a song, and it works. If it's, I don't know, a guy who's in his 20s or 30s, or a girl who's in her 20s and 30s singing a song, they can sing songs that would not make that much sense for like an 80-year-old or like a child to sing. And I'm not talking about it having anything to do with sex. I mean, it could have to do with, I don't know, it could be like Drake's music or something about hustling. Like it would be weird to listen to an 80-year-old or an 8-year-old singing a song about like their hustle and struggle, to make the money or something. But beauty is like a song that anyone could sing at any time, and it's always appropriate. So, but that's true of physics too. Like, that's true of every field. So there are ideas in physics that are attractive, but in a certain context, and they are not actually attractive outside that context. That would be a sexy idea, I guess. And but a beautiful idea is one that is contextualized and meaningful and universally true. So I don't totally disagree with her, but kind of. Carlo Rovelli, we have never spoken about him before, and we will tonight, though. So let's look up his... He's an Italian theoretical physicist and writer who has worked in Italy, the United States, and France. He is distinguished visiting a distinguished visiting research chair at the Perimeter Institute. Works mainly in the field of quantum gravity and is the founder of loop quantum gravity theory. I didn't know that, actually. I thought that was someone else. Interesting. Let's see here. Created. Loop quantum gravity. Weird. We don't even have. He's not even listed on the Wikipedia page for loop quantum gravity. Well, that sucks if he did create it. I didn't know that, though. Let's see what else. Developed a formulation of classical and quantum mechanics that does not make explicit reference to the notion of time. Step towards a theory of quantum gravity without a time variable is described by, sentient singularity theory describes that if you're looking at everything at once, existence at once, or the universe even at once, then time, there is no time, experience of time. It's, you basically, if you're inside the universe looking out, you see space-time, and you can maneuver within space-time, and if you are the universe looking in, then you perceive time-space, and you can maneuver in time, but you can't really maneuver in space. And because of that, though, when I say maneuver in time, you're not going to the future. You're connecting events, but you're perceiving time as an ever-present. So, like, the universe perceives time, or existence, God perceives time as an ever-present, essentially. But as a set of entanglement relationships that's changing. And so basically, we maneuver in space, and as we maneuver in space, the universe or God maneuvers in time and trying to get things lined up. So we go here in space, and God makes an adjustment in time, and we move here in space, and God makes an adjustment to time, and hopefully, helps you not, get into an accident or something like that. So that's that. Okay, first clip. Is it hype? This first clip, by the way, is about the observer. They're discussing the observer and its role in physics. And this is kind of a central theme of this discussion, and it's very important. And we're going to talk about how I just think that that this discussion is crazy. but we'll talk about it.
Is it something that is important to the average viewer out there? Remember, we're not only talking to three exceptionally qualified physicists and me, but we're also talking about we're talking to the general public. And I view, as people know, listen to my channel, I think scientists have a moral obligation to give back to the public who pay our salary. So anyway, Carlo, I'm going to start with you. Opening statement. What are your general thoughts on consciousness and on quantum reality and the nature of reality? And then we'll get into these three themed debates. Carlo, take it away, please.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure. Fast on reality to then we'll have time to go more in depth. Reality, of course, is essential for a physicist, but the reality is subtle. 300 years ago, the Copernican revolution jump-started modern development of science. And essentially, it was a discovery that to make sense about the the motion, what we see in the sky, the planet, the moon, the sun, and the stars, we have to take into account that we're viewing this from our own perspective, to take into account the observer. Not because there's something in our mind, and not because there's consciousness involved, not for some mysterious reason, but because we're sitting on a spinning rock, so we're seeing things spinning because of that. So the observer has always played a role in science. We view the world from our perspective, with our instrument, with our eyes, and we have to take this into account. I think quantum mechanics is more of that. It's telling us basically the same thing. Of course, we talk about reality, what else? But reality is subtle because we view it through our eyes, and we are a physical system like any other in the universe. So we view reality as a physical system interact with the rest of the universe. So yes, we're talking about reality, what else? That's what we want to talk about. Yes, we have to take into account observer. No, in any way, this has to do with consciousness, the mind, or anything like that. I think that quantum mechanics has nothing to do with that. I think that the mind is a fantastic problem, but it has to do with our neurons, the complexity, and not in any way that I can understand directly with quantum mechanics. But certainly, and I close here, quantum mechanics is telling us that this interactive way which makes reality. So the fact that, like in the Copernican system, what we see, it's interaction between the sky and us, goes very deep. And in a sense, all properties of all physical systems come about in interactions with other systems. Yes, quantum mechanics tell us that the observer is very important, but not because our mind is important or consciousness is important, because reality is interaction. So we describe always from the perspective of some physical system. That's where I stand.
Okay, so much to talk about with this. This is going to be a good stream, I think. It was a bit slow, like to start, because, like I said, technical issues. But this is the fundamental discussion in physics right now that we have to move things forward. I agree with him on a number of things that he said, so let's do that first. That our physical reality comes about through interaction between multiple systems. Okay, that is true according to my work, and I have models of it. That time-space versus space-time model that I was talking about. That basically shows that space and time are emergent from interaction between the system that you are within and you as a system. But the thing is, though, is that both of those are minds. So here's where I disagree with him. And so for him to say something like, we have to take into account the observer, but quantum mechanics has nothing to do with the mind, it has nothing to do with consciousness, and I don't like using the word consciousness very much anymore because it is kind of vague and it has become a bit overused, but we'll talk about that later, and not used specifically enough or rigorously enough. Or in rigorous enough models, and because of that, it ends up just. It seems like a retreat, which is that's a quote that's a word that Sabine says later in this stream that we're going to talk about, but it's not this. There is a reason that consciousness keeps coming up in every single discussion about quantum physics online. There is no discussion about quantum physics that I see or listen to or read anymore ever that does not involve questions and discussions about consciousness. Why is this? Sabine calls it a retreat, and they kind of Carlo also kind of says that we attribute something to being about consciousness when it's just mysterious and we don't understand it. That might be true sometimes, but I actually also just think that in physics, it is because everybody intuitively knows that that's what this is about. And the only ones who don't want to really admit this, and who ironically want to take this idea, or want to treat this idea as if it is, not a good one, are the most accredited physicists in the world. For most of them, not all of them. You have Penrose and things like that. We'll talk about that. But the reason for this is because I think that to change the narrative at this point is to admit that incompetence. It's to admit incompetence, and that is not something that most people want to do if they have a degree in something. But the thing is, though, is that you can't say that you have to take into account the observer. You can't escape the perspective of the observer. We are an observer viewing the world through our own perspective, and also quantum mechanics has nothing to do with consciousness or the mind. That said, the specific symmetry structures of the particles in the standard model and such, that whether or not that has to do with mind is a different discussion, but I would say they absolutely do. The symmetry structures of the standard model are two fiber bundles interacting, which is two minds, two strings of information cross, and when they do, it excites a particle, the observation of a particle, and different particles come from different types of interactions. But if that is fundamentally true, though, by the way, and you hold out that this is not about the mind and the mind has nothing to do with this, you're literally stuck forever. Just so you know. Like, think about that. Just assume for the sake of argument that that is true. That means if that is true and you don't actually take that idea seriously, you cannot go forward in physics at all beyond where we are. And I think that is why we have not gone forward in physics for decades. But what's also interesting and just wrong here is the idea that we should leave the mind and the study of the mind to neuroscientists because it has to do with neurons and the brain. Neurons and the brain are not where you go to learn about consciousness or the mind. The mind is not the brain. The mind is your totality of your being, and it is your perspectives and information processing loops and your ability to interact with your environment and then interpret your environment and sense your environment and interact and sense with yourself as well. So this is not you don't relegate this question or relegate constraints of mind and the understanding of mind to just the neuroscientists. And like this is something that if anybody needs to understand this, I mean, everybody needs to understand this. That's the reality. I mean, if we are inside of a mind and you are a mind, which you are a mind, then the structure of mind is where everything comes from. Mathematics and all the structures within mathematics, all the patterns in mathematics, physics, all the particles in physics, all the emergent phenomena in physics, relativity, quantum mechanics, biological evolution. I mean, everything comes from these structures, if this is true. And so I get it, he doesn't think that this is true, but you can't say that this is about the observer and we have to always take into account the observer, but we don't have to take into account mind. That makes no sense. And the idea that, you just have to take into account the observer not because mind is important, but because we're on a spinning rock. This is something that this statement is a statement that confines you to relativity from the very start. You cannot move beyond it if you're just assuming that we're on a spinning rock. And I'm not saying we're not on a spinning rock. I'm just saying we're also not just on a spinning rock. Okay, that is space-time is emergent. It's not fundamental. So you're not fundamentally on a spinning rock. You are emergently perceiving yourself on a spinning rock from specific perspectives, but you are not fundamentally on a spinning rock. And that is the only time that you have to take into account, the observer. It's just, it drives me a bit crazy to hear this type of, these types of statements. I also even hear this with, like, Donald Hoffman, where he takes it way further, and he's much closer to understanding, I think, the nature of reality. But then he'll say, like, in his conscious agent theory, that a conscious agent is not it's not a sentient being, I guess. He's used other words, and that just doesn't make sense. Like, it's like a constructor, and constructor theory is not the same thing as a sentient being either. Every single one of these theories is like an observer is not a mind, and we don't have to understand mind. And I'm not saying he's not saying that an observer is not mind, but he's saying that we have to account for the observer, but we don't have to account for mind in any way. It's just inconsistent, and I'm probably not doing the best job explaining it, but we're going to continue this.
Very good. And Sabine, you have,
by the way,
many occasions.
I still greatly appreciate everybody in this discussion, and I respect all of them.
About the hype that surrounds this particular topic. There's no small amount of insults hurled at people that talk about quantum healing, quantum, all sorts of things in your work. Talk about your position on this matter.
Yeah, so I would say scientists can't understand reality independent of the observer, and they never have, because scientists are observers. So we can't get rid of the observer. But maybe I should say that I can't understand reality independent of the observer, and I never have, because I'm not sure that you actually exist. For this reason, I'm not a realist. I saw that Eric made a remark on Twitter that he's guessing he's in team reality. I guess it puts me in the team anti-reality, whatever that means. So I'm not a realist because I think it's scientifically indefensible. I can't prove that anything exists besides me. So from the scientific perspective, I would say I'm an instrumentalist. The task of science is not to figure out some truth about reality, whatever that might mean. But the task is to find descriptions of our observations, not more and not less. But I have to admit, realism is a good working hypothesis. So for practical purposes, I think it makes sense that I assume you exist for the time being. That seems to describe quite well what I observe. So I'm happy, to use realism as a kind of an assumption, but I think we have to keep in mind that after all, it's just a philosophy. This doesn't mean, though, that measurement outcomes depend on the observer. We know that measurement outcomes depend on the measurement. This isn't something which is specific to quantum mechanics. It's generally always the case. If you're measuring a small system with a big apparatus, then you're changing the thing that you're trying to measure. This is something we always have to take into account. Like Carlo, I don't think that there's a particular role to be played by consciousness, but I can't really exclude this either. It's just that I personally think that the problems which we currently have in quantum mechanics and cosmology can be solved without retreating to talks about consciousness.
So solve them. Like, why are they not solved? Question. Like, why do you keep talking about consciousness, and do you keep denying that that's a fundamental aspect of this, and why have you not solved things under your current assumption? Probably a good question. Yeah.
And Eric, is Team Reality similar to Team America? What exactly is Team Reality? And do we have to worry about the end of reality in any meaningful sense? At least not today, hopefully.
Hopefully not today. I, I think that in a certain sense, we're all trying to figure out what would a productive fight be, and to do it constructively and collaboratively. So let me just say that I agree with Sabine that we can't for sure say that anyone else exists, but what I would say is that there's a simple article of faith many of us try to hide in our science. And in my case, I would say it's that the universe is not maximally pathological. You could imagine a pathological universe in which you could not discover the nature of its rules because it's sort of constructed to occlude your vision. And happily, we have not seemed to find ourselves in that situation. And I think that there's sort of a tale of two narcissisms here. There's the narcissism of believing that you're at the center of this story as an observer, and that you have, in some sense, failed to recognize that you're present. And then there's another narcissism where you put yourself at the center, and you talk about relativism endlessly, and the inability to remove yourself from the system. And of course, it's hard to get out of that sort of devil in the deep blue sea problem. So I would say that observers are important, but they may not be absolutely dispositive. You know, the status of the observer may not, in fact, be the crux on which everything hangs. And the last thing I would say, which is probably the most meaningful, is that there's an expression, the map is not the territory. And when the world was not mapped well, maps changed frequently as discoveries of new lands were made or filled in with more specificity. One of the great dangers of stagnation in theoretical physics is that general relativity is now over 100 years old, and our modern picture of quantum theory is about 50 years old. And so as these maps have not been changing for effectively a human lifetime, maybe a short one, 50 years, we're in danger of seeing the same map over and over again and starting to believe that the map is the territory. And so if we were adding to the standard model into general relativity, I think we would be in less danger of codifying these things as reality themselves, as opposed to simply models of them on our way to something where the map might finally be the territory. And that would be sort of the final theory.
I totally agree with him. This description of a theory of everything as the map that is the territory is very good. It is going to also end up being like the constructs of mind, and that is the map that is the territory. Then you go and you look at the particles in the standard model, and you'll see that the symmetry structures align, and you'll be like, okay, that's a map that's not the territory, but it's kind of close to it, but whereas relativity would not be. But quantum mechanics is kind of tough because we got ourselves into a bit of a spot with it, I think, where it's essentially metaphysics, and it's not thought about as metaphysics. But it would be better thought about as metaphysics. It's not the same field as general relativity and thermodynamics and Newtonian physics. It's just not the same. Even though it's linked, because every field is linked, they all build on each other. It's not the same field, and it's kind of in a weird spot where it's basically the goal of it is to map the same structure, the same like picture that is the structure of mind, the construct of mind, but it's manifesting in a physical form around you, because you're in a mind, and the thoughts and and constructs and processes of the mind that you are within manifest as hard reality to you, because there's because there's a hierarchy. So the way that you rectify this issue, this tale of two narcissisms that Eric Weinstein's talking about, I think, where he's saying, there's one where you're just an observer at the center of this, and and then there's this other one where you are an observer and you're stuck in endless relativism, essentially. So, where your perspective is not the ultimate perspective. The way that you rectify this is through the recognition that an observer perspective is not, the perspective of the observer is not relative or fundamental. It's relative and fundamental, and that you organize the perspectives of those observers, you organize those observers of those perspectives into a hierarchy in order to determine which one would be objective and which one would be subjective, or which one would be fundamental and which one would be relativistic. And this only is possible in a structure where where basically mind is fundamental, and you're just universe and reality is just minds within minds, because this allows for a hierarchy structure to manifest and for observers to always be accounted for, but also it also allows for the observation of fundamentality and relativity, because if you're the mind within the mind, within another mind, your perspective relative to the perspective of the mind that you're within is relative, or it's subjective, is another way of putting it. You're subject to the mind that you're in, but the mind that you are within has an objective or fundamental perspective compared to you. So this is the way that this is rectified, and it's very hard to do it outside of a model like sentient singularity theory, and because you need something that is defined, but you also need it to be mental structures, I guess, like nested holonic structures is what my abstract describes it as on my website under writings. If you didn't see it in the beginning, you can read what basically sentient singularity theory states, and it's a quasi-periodic nested fractal pattern of minds within minds. So it's more detailed than that, but that is the environment in which there's no paradox and conflict between the subjective and the objective, I guess. You need both, and they both do exist. It's just, you have to think about from the universe's perspective. There's no, there's no space, because it is space. So, like, what are its degrees of freedom? Oh, well, it can change entanglement relationships of particles within it, or, essentially something like that. But if you have to think about it from the universe's perspective, as that would be an objective perspective. But from our perspective, within the universe, looking out and interacting with this universe, and the universe interacting with us, what are those constraints and degrees of freedom? That environment or that framework will allow you to just bypass any of these apparent paradoxical or conflicts, essentially. So also, where Sabine says, like, she's not a realist because she doesn't know if you're real. This is my issue with philosophy these days, is like, it's just got endless terms, and That's why when people are like, "Are you an idealist? Are you a realist? Are you a materialist?" I'm like, I believe in matter, and I have like a definition of it that I'm pretty sure is accurate. I believe in ideas, but like, what if what we perceive as matter is the ideas of the mind that we're within? So like, is that idealism or is that materialism? Well, it's subjectively materialism, but objectively idealism. This is why I don't like these terms in philosophy, or realism, because when I first started questioning the nature of like my reality at the very beginning of this journey, I asked myself like, what is real? And then I realized I am real. And then I was like, well, what if, is anybody else real? And eventually I came to the conclusion that most likely they are, because it's meaningless without that. And it's pathological, maximally pathological, as Eric Weinstein would put it. And I don't think that that is the case. It's funny because he says that, and it's basically like anthropomorphizing the universe. And because you have to, though. Like, that, he was right. I think that was the mindset kind of that I had. It's that it's more meaningful for us to be real and interacting. But the thing is that if you know that you're real, then this environment that you're within, at least, is real. That is, I mean, you could then question, well, are the people around me really real? In the same way that I am, and that's a good question to ask, but don't let it destroy your life. I think that the answer is yes, but if then the thing is, though, is that if you are real, the world is real. It's real enough. Like, how much more real do you need need your life to be if you're other than you are real? You exist. So I don't really like those terms of realism, materialism, idealism. They just don't really make sense outside of, like I said, being contextualized within like a nested hierarchy of minds. But so basically what we've gone through is Eric, I don't really know exactly what he's getting at as far as his...
I'm sorry for any Europeans who don't get either one of those references.
His thoughts on, whether or not the observer is important, or consciousness. I mean, he does give it later, and we'll talk about it. He's much more specific about his thoughts on discussing consciousness. Basically, he thinks that this conversation is boring, and I do agree with him. Usually, it's boring. Discussions of panpsychism are usually boring because they don't go anywhere. But neither does materialism. It's just institutionally accepted. That's the difference. You have to, that's why you can't be, I'm not a materialist. It's like, this water bottle it exists to me like as much as it needs to. So, but it's coming from mind, and so I'm not even an idealist, because where do ideas come from? Fundamentally, they have to come from someone who is, a mind. So that's why when people ask me what are you, a materialist or an idealist, or are you Christian or religious or Jewish, or like, what are you? I'm like, I'm a theist. That's that is my belief structure in physics and in morality and everything else. So it just makes it simple. I think the rest of these words do have use, but in context, and we're using them outside of context. We're using the word materialism completely outside of context. The only one who I see using it more in context, in proper context, regularly, kind of, I think, is Donald Hoffman, and because he knows that it's emergent, essentially. So, but basically, just know, going into this next clip, that Carlo Rovelli and Sabine and also not exactly Eric, I don't think, but still doesn't like the discussion. But Sabine and Carlo both do not think that this has to do with consciousness. But before we go to the next clip, I know that observer has like a specific in physics definition, and I think that that's kind of weird. In quantum mechanics, an observer is anything that detects a quantum particle. Okay, what detects? Like, this is my issue when people are like, well, an observer. People talk about an observer, and the observer is, they're not using it in the physics manner. What if physics is using it wrong? Like, what if that's the case? And I think that it's not completely using it wrong, but it is using it in such a limited fashion that it is literally useless. It's so outside of context that it's a useless statement. And to say an observation is also called a measurement by an observer, and an observer is anything that detects a quantum particle. Understanding the role of an observer depends upon understanding the special role of measurement in quantum mechanics. Observer conscious. Okay, well, let's move on, but I'll show you why this is important in this next clip.
Talk about and I'm sorry for any Europeans who don't get either one of those references, but the question that I have is really one of, do we get mired down? Merman, I think it was, said, shut up and calculate. For me, I was told by Jim Peebles, shut up and measure, make observations rather. The question is, what is the importance, if any, and I'll start with Carlo, what is the importance of talking about an observer? Can we uncover objective reality without understanding the structures, the mind, the limitations of an observer? Carlo, could you address that? Do we have to talk about the nature of the person doing the operation of observation?
Well, let me address this question of the light also what Sabine and Eric said before, of this debate of sort of realism versus instrumentalism, as Sabine put at the beginning. I think I'm not too far from any of the two, of Eric and Sabine, and I'll come to your question in the following sense. Sabine started off by saying, I cannot say for sure that there is a reality out there beside me, and of course she's right. This is a well-known fact. But I think she would agree in continuing this by saying, well, and this is not very interesting after all, because I don't think that science, and this is the main point I want to get at, I don't think that science is about find certainty about things. That's never have been the motivation, at least for the best scientists around, and for the people I think who have in different manners understood what science is through the centuries and today. Science is not about uncovering the final objective reality or finding complete certainty about something. Science is a process in which we learn about what is around us through our interaction with the rest, and we come up with a story, tools for thinking about what we call reality, which is the thing we interact with. Are we sure of any of this? No, of course, like the turkey of your story, we're not sure of anything, but we have extremely good reasons for taking very seriously facts like that the moon is there, even if I don't see, and that there are the kind of astronomical things that the two Brians see in the sky, in the sky, and that inside the sun there are actually the nuclear reactions. So science is credible. It's credible, it's reliable, it's credible in its predictions without any need of making philosophical ultimate statement about yes, we know the absolute reality, but nevertheless using heavily the notion of reality, because this is one of the main tools that physicists and scientists in general work. Scientists work with a mixture of instrumentalists. They're very ready, the best ones, to take what they know for reality out there, and as Eric was saying, be able to change the mind about that is a thing that is real, right? I mean, what we think is out there in the world, and the world is made of, is changing, and it will be changing again. So reality changes the best way we understand it, the way we understand it. So what we do is science. I think we are evolving a best way for interacting with what we call reality outside, and we can use the expression objectivity, we can use expression of reality without being afraid of, but also without overplaying things. We're never certain about anything. That's the bottom line. And then you ask, do we have to take into account the mind of the observer? I would say not in any substantial way, but very often in a useful way, of course. I mean, you say you don't ask about your mind if you go to the laboratory, but maybe you were drunk, and I take into account your mind. That's what you say. And,
maybe.
And we.
What do you mean, maybe?
And, well, I don't know. And I have to count how my instruments work, and the limitation of my brain, which certainly are, and all that. And ultimately, I have also to take into account that, of course, what I'm interacting with. It's a reality I'm interacting with. So I see through the interaction, and I should not follow, and I close here, in what Eric called the two narcissism, especially the narcissism of saying, well, the only thing I'm sure is myself, and therefore I start by assuming that I exist, everything else no. I'm an only child. This is a kind of mistake that only children make when they're very small, but then maybe perhaps a little bit later than those who have brothers and sisters, even the only children learn that no, it doesn't make. It's not useful to think about the universe that as you the only existing thing. You being me, Carlo, we our connection with the rest of the reality.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm also an only child, but I'm not my parents' favorite child. Famous statement, but I think it's more like the hard problem of the measurement problem. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe respond to Carlo. But also, aren't we really just talking about stuff that's been trodden ground for 100 years, as you said, 50 years certainly? It's a measurement problem at some level of bedrock, right?
Yeah, and the problem is that I would like to just dispense with this all, but I would not be fair to the system, because like Bell's inequalities were done relatively late in the quantum story, so that even though I have a prejudice that says we shouldn't wallow infinitely in the foundations of quantum theory, that's a good counterexample where I would have been wrong, is that I probably would have discouraged Dr. Bell from doing his work. So it may be, and it's possible, that all of this theorizing about quantum foundations and the measurement problem will be productive. I mean, to the extent that I've tried to contribute at all to that discussion, I've tried to take the point of view that classical theory is either deterministic or mute. If you ask a good question, it's deterministic. And if you ask a bad question, it doesn't attempt to help you out in any way to pretend that your question was good. Quantum mechanics is exactly as deterministic as classical theory when you're asking a good question. And we should say what a good question is. The state of the system is presented with a huge infinite list of multiple choice answers. Are you in this state? Are you in that state? Are you in the other state? And we call those eigenfunctions or eigenvectors, but we might as well just call them multiple choice answers. And, they have different values. Those would be, is it 7? Is it 17.3? Those would be called eigenvalues. And the key question is the state of the system on the list of good answers for that question? The question would be called an observable. So that's to try to make this a little bit less physicsy and a little bit more just common sense. A bad question would be a question in which the state of the system is not represented by any particular answer on the list. So you come back from, let's say, Europe, and you get a landing card which says, did you accumulate funds? Answer A.
Okay, I'm going to be able to describe this easier than him, I think. But he's right, and this is one of the things that Eric talks about a lot, and it's something that I noticed in my work too, and is that the importance of the right question is total. So we normally go and we judge answers to questions. We don't judge questions very much, and we're actually brought up in our academic, from the very beginning of our academic, indoctrination, to be told there's no such thing as bad question. There are bad questions, and if you ask a bad question, you'll never get a right answer. And so what he's talking about when he's talking about how quantum mechanics is just as deterministic as anything else, as any other question within relativity, essentially, is, I think, true. It's just a matter of asking the right questions, and we ask the wrong questions, and so what happens is we get probabilistic answers in quantum mechanics. You get, it's this percentage, likely the electron is over here or it's over there, and it's just it's just probabilistic. Probability, when you really understand probability and you can visualize it very well, and I kind of was very good at probability in college. In my I took some probability classes, and you understand that it's just geometry. And the thing is, though, is that when you have like imagine this, okay? Imagine that there is a wave, and that wave is like a string of information going like this in a wave. And you ask the question, is the point, or is that wave here, okay? Or is the point, is the particle that you observe, that is the point on a wave, like an electron? That's what an electron is. It's a point on a wave. Is it here or here? And the thing is, though, is that because your question is wrong. Your question is, where is the electron? Okay? It's not a particle. It's not really a particle. You have to, if you want to answer where is a question about that gives you a picture, an accurate picture of what that bit of information is doing that gives rise to the perspective of an electron. What you have to do is you have to contextualize it. So you have to know that it is a wave and not a particle, and you do that by knowing where the perspective of a particle comes from, and you do that by knowing that you are a mind within a mind, and that what's happening is that information is being processed in the mind that you are within, and when you perceive that information, the wave of information, and you look at it, the constraints of mind, of your mind, the constraints that come from a mind's ability to focus itself, and orient, which means it has the ability to focus in a direction, cause the observation of a point, which is then called a particle, which we call an electron. And you understand that by understanding that we are inside of a mind, And granted, I could be wrong about all this. I'm very confident, though. But if you're asking the wrong question of where is an electron, it's not a particle. It's not like a proton or a neutron. It is totally different. And it doesn't exist as a holonic structure, fundamentally as a holonic structure. It is a point caused by the constraints of focus, the constraints of mind involved in focusing. And you're just witnessing an information processing wave. And you're like, you can only look at one point. So, but that is exactly, if that's correct, then what they're saying is wrong. What Carlo is saying is where you don't have to understand the constraints of mind and in order to actually understand the universe, because they're not really particularly related. And when he's like talking about whether or not you're drunk and you're going to the lavatory or something like that, that's not a constraint of mind that that's fundamental. I think Brian's question is great, actually, though. I think it's the question that people in physics should be asking, but the problem is that it's useless to ask it unless you're willing to consider contextualizing it within an ordered mental universe model. I don't want to say panpsychism, because this water bottle is not conscious in sentient singularity theory. The compounds, the molecular compounds, like, those are conscious, the atoms are conscious, the hadrons might be conscious, but water molecule, it would be conscious, but not the water bottle. Like, that's caused by entanglement structures, potentially, at least, I'm proposing. And so that's not a traditional panpsychist perspective. So I don't want to say even panpsychism. I think that you don't even need, if panpsychism's fundamental, like most fundamental assumption is true, which is that consciousness is fundamental, not that everything is conscious, because things are not conscious. Sentient singularity theory splits up the world, our world, into two structures: beings and things. And beings are fundamental, and things are not. And things are defined and observed by beings, and beings do not arise from things, unlike the current assumption in our sciences would assume. But I disagree with Carlo completely, is what I'm saying. So I think that if you want to actually understand the electron, and you want to understand what would be a good question to ask about an electron, so that you get a deterministic answer that is not probabilistic, then you have to understand the constraints of mind, and you also have to understand the context of you and the universe and the nature of it. This is a multifaceted problem. You can't just jump from, I will now take into account the constraints of mind, and now I will be able to answer these questions. Information is context. It's not. There's no information in context and information outside of context. There's only context, which is information. There is no such thing as information outside context. They are one and the same. They're just two different perspectives on one thing, which is an idea. And or thought, I guess you could say. Thought is information and context. But it's not, they're not separate, and they're not separable. So this is why this is so tough, and my paper talks about this, is like, you, in order to make dramatic progress on many things going forward, which you can't really make that much progress on even little things other than experimental engineering things. My dog is itching herself, sorry. She just got a bath though. But yeah, you have to basically have gotten close, at least, to having an accurate-ish model of the universe and the nature of reality. The reason why Eric is so much more competent in this discussion than the other two in regards to these questions is because he has a pretty accurate model of a theory of everything. And you can't answer questions about the nature of reality or the observer without that. You have to you have to have so many things figured out at once to contextualize everything within some framework that is relatively true. I remember once I was listening to Eric talk to his brother about physics, and it was on his brother's YouTube channel, Brett Weinstein's YouTube channel, and Eric's like, can we just call an electron what it is? Damn it, like, it's a wave. And I was like, yes. Like, that is, to call it a particle is to confuse. You're getting information outside of context, which means you're not getting any information. You can't make sense of that. So that's why when people are like, they try and compare a proton and an electron, and a neutron, they'll order them in their thinking in just kind of as all being fundamental structures. This doesn't work, and it's because we don't discuss what an electron actually is. It's just considered another particle. But even though, yeah, protons and neutrons are hadrons, and I get it, they're composite structures. But an electron isn't. It doesn't have self-awareness. It's not able to make decisions. There's no information processing that is being done by an electron. There's information processing that is being done, and it is like two streams of information are crossing, and it's an excitation of a fiber bundle. That's what it is, but that's not what a proton is as much. Kind of a proton is a fiber bundle in and of itself, almost. If that makes sense. It is a mind.
Pounds be all in Europe.
Tom Campbell is probing the question of the role of the observer in his experiments. I definitely need to look more into his experiments. Tom Campbell, I think, is one of the, from what I've heard of, and I actually have, I'm going to be doing a stream on one of his videos, probably the one that you sent me, Ethan. So that is to come, but I think he's on to a lot more than like most of these people who are more mainstream, like Sabine or Carlo. I cannot come up with a single sentence where adding the word emergent adds any meaning to the sentence other than trying to sound intelligent. Emergent means that it's not fundamental. So emergent means it's like it arises from a specific contextual interaction. It arises in the context of a specific interaction. That is what an emergent kind of means. So, like if I say the like physical space or physical things like this water bottle is emergent, it means that this water bottle doesn't exist when nobody's looking at it. And as a water bottle, basically it is emergent due to my perspective in the universe and the entanglement structure of the molecules and atoms and hadrons that make it up. It's not fundamentally, it doesn't exist as a fundamental structure, so it is a perceived structure, if that makes sense. Saying emergent isn't just about trying to sound smart. And I do understand there's a lot of words that people say that are just kind of come off as just trying to sound smart. Emergent is kind of one of those that it's like meta, or something. But meta is like the opposite of emergent. But emergent actually is very useful when you contextualize it properly. The problem is that when people say space-time is emergent, and then you're like, okay, it's emergent. From what? Like, that's when it's all of a sudden sounds like, okay, you're just using the word emergent to say it's not fundamental, but you don't, like, there's no specific definition of emergent that is useful and really makes sense and kind of orients you in your ability to order the world. But it is used a lot in physics these days because people are starting to talk about how space-time is emergent, or they'll say space-time is dead, but really what they mean is it's emergent, and meaning it comes from something else. There's something deeper that is more true, that is not true, that is not as subjectively dependent. So I think emergent is a good word, but it has to be used properly. There's a lot of words, though, that I don't like that are kind of like that, like esoteric. I don't like the word esoteric. I don't really think that anything... I understand what, like, the old definition of esoteric, like hidden wisdom, kind of. Hidden knowledge, but, like, not hidden purposely, but, like, hidden as in, like, it's hard to see. But we don't use it like that. Every way in which we use it now is like elitist and weird and or useless, kind of like how you think emergent. All things arise from the context of a specific interaction. Yes, but no, that's not exactly true. Like there are fundamental structures to the universe that do exist, and they are the structure of mind. The universe existence as a mind is not. It doesn't arise from the interaction necessarily of context, from some contextual interaction. It is the interactor. Like it's not everything is arising from the context of a specific interaction. I would say when you're not looking at the moon, it doesn't exist. When you're not looking at your water bottle and nobody else is, it doesn't exist. Kind of. I mean, somebody made it, so like it was perceived by a conscious being. So like I don't really know if it doesn't exist, but it's not really. It's not there. It's not rendered. But the atoms, when you're not looking at this water bottle, the atoms that make up this water bottle do still exist. Okay, so that is a fundamental distinction, where they are rendered because they are self-perceiving. Like you, when I don't look at you, if you are a sentient being, you still exist because you are perceiving self. You are perceiving yourself. And because of that, you exist even when, nobody else within the universe is looking. I mean, the universe looks at you anyways, but and people have seen you, and so like you do exist. But even if you could say that things exist when they've been perceived, and even if when you're not looking at them, somebody perceived them at some point. So the information is saved, kind of, but it's not rendered. And this is kind of I don't like the term holographic universe because that's just, I don't think that that's useful. But it is kind of a digital, it's digital to some degree, but it's not digital in the way we think. You're running inside of a quantum computer, which is different than a computer like what I'm streaming to you through. It's just not the same. Okay, we got to pick it up, as I say always.
See, all in Swiss francs, all in Swedish currency. It's strange that
fall in this debate.
Okay. This is a statement about paradoxes. This is going to be quick. By Eric Weinstein, and how we need new models that rectify certain paradoxes.
So I'm very unmoved by the attempts to answer those questions within our current framework. I'd rather expand the framework and then try to get at those questions rather than imagine that we can solve the puzzle of quantum measurement from this particular set of models. And when you hear people say that space-time has got to go and that we need a really big new theory in order to make progress, what they're effectively saying is there may be new maps of this territory, and in the new maps, these are not huge paradoxes. But I really feel like if we want to answer these questions, the thing to do is new models, new equations, new Lagrangians, rather than trying to figure it out from here, because I think we have a pretty solid answer that this is state of the art for the most part relative to the maps of reality that we've built. And I think that it's going to be the new maps of reality that are going to allow us to make progress.
Great.
100% agree. Again, one thing I will say, though, that I do disagree with, I don't disagree, but I think he's running into an issue, I think, with geometric unity, in that where in that next map, the map is the territory, you need a map that rectifies that. You need models that have different. They're totally different in the way that we even write them out than our current frameworks, because our current frameworks come from those models. So a meta theory, or a theory of everything, is responsible for mathematics. It's responsible for physics. It's not a physics theory. It's not a math theory alone. It's not a physics theory alone. It's not a biological theory alone. It's all of those and more, and those fields that are specific and emergent, or emerge from a fundamental theory in which the map is the territory. That means you can't use mathematical equations the same way that we do normally in mathematics and in physics. The way that we use just mathematics as a language in and of itself is basically the same. You're trying to use something that stems from, you're putting the cart before the horse, is what you're doing. So you can't do that. So when you need a new model, you need a totally new model. Like, you need a new way of organizing all of this. So I think it needs to be something that isn't just equations written out like, the way that we normally do it. It has to be like a structure that calculates and builds itself. And obviously it's a model, so it's not going to be totally encompassing of every bit of, of reality, but if you're going to start modeling fundamentality, then you have to start modeling growth, which is not just growth. it's growth of structure and of information processing in that structure. So growth of process and structure, which is like constructs. But they can't use our current language as much as we or linguistic or mathematical frameworks. Like they're gonna explain our current mathematical and scientific for other scientific frameworks. So my models are very different, and I think that my lack of academic experience actually helped me in that I don't think that there's no class that you can take to do like a theory of everything. You have to just start thinking about like, okay, how do we build within a certain context, assuming some nature of of the universe, and then like let's just start from there and just start building. And what are the constraints and degrees of freedom that leads to, and what are the structures that emerge from it, and do those structures align with our current physics frameworks? And this definitely does. And we'll talk more about that later. But this is not an equation the same way that if you read geometric unity or the paper or something like that, or even look at just a simple, matrix. Even though that's much closer to, I think, it's a better way of modeling fundamental reality. So if you read like Garrett Lisi's paper and you look at all the matrices that are in it, I think it's a beautiful paper. But this does have calculation. There's a bunch of different, it is calculating. Every number here is calculated. I didn't input any of them. You just input 1. If you input 0, you get nothing. If you input, I don't know, 2, you'll get a bunch of different numbers. But you start from 1 always, because you can only start from 1, and so all these numbers get calculated. And I'm not claiming to understand exactly everything that this means, but I'm hoping, people figure more out about it over time if it's correct. But it does line up in so many ways with our current models. Kind of, probably. Anyways, next clip. But the map is the territory in that. It's a different kind of model. Okay, just to show again how crazy this is. This discussion was good, but it was also very highlighting of a big problem. And normally, when I show, I'm normally not very. Normally not very critical in this like these live streams. I'm normally showing you discussions in which I pretty much agree with what is being said, and I show you clips where people are stating things that I think are that I agree with, and but sometimes I will throw in something in which I have strong disagreement. This entire discussion, not all of what is said in it, because there's some things that are said in it that I totally agree with by all of them, but some more than others. But there are assumptions throughout this entire discussion that I think are the reason that we are, at least it's probably the main reason we have not made progress in physics. But kudos to Brian for asking these questions. This next question is about, do you need an observer to make a measurement? Okay, guys.
Come back to the measurement problem. I mean, there's a reason the measurement problem is called measurement problem and not observer problem, because you don't necessarily need an observer to make a measurement. What you need to make a measurement is an apparatus. So I really don't see how anything like consciousness even comes into the question. But this doesn't mean that the role of the observer doesn't play any role in physics. I mean, for one thing, as you yourself certainly know, our own position and what we can observe with our telescopes introduces a bias in the data that we get, which we have to take into account. Like if we look out in the cosmos, there are certain stellar objects or galaxies and so on that we can observe and others that we can't observe. And if we want to make some statistics out of this, we have to take into account which direction did we look into? What's the kind of data that our telescopes can even capture? So this is certainly something that we need to take into account.
Okay, I gotta not let her talk too much because I've gotta pick it up. But this is nonsense. I mean, first of all, it's very clear that Carlo and Sabine, and this is not their, fault or anything like that, but they're both very stuck in relativity. And this is, this is the problem in every field, including physics, not just physics. But where both times in which they have talked about the importance of the observer and our personal perspective when basically calling themselves the observer and referencing the importance of their perspective, they have mentioned it within the context of relativity and in space. So, and I mean outer space, not just like space around us, but like outer space. Carlo talked about, we're on a spinning rock, and Sabine talked about, looking through telescopes out into space. And that's not wrong, but it's just not fundamental. Like there's nothing to be gained that's new and that's groundbreaking. I'm not saying there's nothing new to be learned. I'm just saying or new discoveries to be made. There certainly is, but there's new discoveries to be made in every field constantly. It's not like biology is dead. I mean, you want to study just one species of slug that has already been studied, you can still learn things about it. But if you want to make like groundbreaking progress on the foundations of science, and then you cannot be stuck in relativity anymore. And Eric is the only one that's broken out of that. Even though I know Carlo does have he has loop quantum gravity, and I don't know much about it though. I do think that information is organized into loops. Basically, a sentience or a consciousness is a loop of information. It's a self-referencing, like, information processing structure. So, but kind of like the God or the universe existence is a loop of information that is tying itself into knots and knots within knots and knots within knots and knots within knots. And so I don't know if how related that is to loop quantum gravity, but it doesn't seem like he has broken out of relativity the way that Eric has. But I don't know, from just one conversation, but it does seem that way. But the point is the main point of this clip that is just crazy to me is to say you don't need an observer to make a measurement. You just need an apparatus. You can't have an apparatus without a sentient observer, a sentient user to interpret that information. That's like saying you can think without a person. You just need a computer. Does your computer think? Like if you aren't doing anything, even if you hit process, like, and you're running a program and you hit like go, and you leave the room and it's running this YouTube video or something like that, and it's processing information, it's not really like is it it's not making an observation. It's not actually taking a measurement. The measurement is only contextualized and relevant within, the perspective of a sentient being. Like a computer has no thoughts. It doesn't make any measurements that are that count for anything outside of you, and and your interaction with it. This is the same thing. This is the problem with what she's saying. It's like to say that an observation in physics is to make a measurement, and that you don't need an observer or sentient being, a conscious being, in order to make a measurement. You just need an apparatus. But you need a sentient being to make and interpret the results of the measurement of that apparatus. Like, that apparatus doesn't exist without a sentient being, and the information that it measures doesn't matter, because it doesn't measure anything. Like, like I said, there's no information outside of context. So to say that it's still gathering information, no, it's not. If nobody ever looked at it, ever, then it wouldn't. Like, if it wasn't even, you basically would have to say that an apparatus was created without any intention by a sentient being, or action by a sentient being, or observation by a sentient being, and still was able to gather information for her statement to be correct, which that sounds crazy, because it is. It doesn't make any sense. I don't understand how people do this. This is why I have a problem when people say, like, an observer is a very specific thing in physics. It doesn't mean you're, just somebody who's making an observation. It has to, or else it's a useless word. It doesn't matter how they use it in academia if they're using it in a way that's useless. Watch this. Again, another one. Like I said, hats off to anybody.
Also, friends of many of us on here today. So, but of course,
anybody willing to go out and put themselves out there like this, I have enormous respect for. Everybody on this in this stream. So, but I think that this idea that you can separate consciousness or mind from an observation it's legitimately insane. It's legitimately insane. There's no other way to put it.
as I said in the very beginning, Sir Roger, mentions that this whole issue, as he says, reeks, and I can't do his voice. I mean, I would. None of us are British, unfortunately, but we could do it. So he said that consciousness reeks of an observer, and so it seems to be, again, not to rehash this all, but I think this notion that Carlo has stated on other occasions that there's a relationalism to both to these issues, and I wonder, as an experimentalist. I actually salute the work that Roger and Stewart are doing to actually try to do, we have this canonical kind of quantum experiment, paradigm of something being perturbed. But I wonder, Carlo, is there something that we could do that make the measurement independent of the observer? Is there anything that we could use? Maybe it's a cosmological experiment, as Sabine might have been hinting at. But do you agree with Sir Roger that this, that consciousness is so deeply embedded it almost cannot be extracted from this issue?
No.
What? What is going? I hope Eric. I hope this laugh that he let out right here is because he's just laughing at the insanity of this statement. I hope so, because otherwise I don't understand that laugh. That's insane. That's insane. It's so insane. I don't normally do streams like this where I'm just so critical, but this issue has to be addressed. And like I said, I have utmost respect for these people. They are brilliant. They've done so much, and I'm not saying that their work is useless or anything like that. That's not true at all. But and whatever the true framework is, I think that their work, even though they might have the wrong perspective on on certain things now that prevent them from taking things forward, that doesn't mean that what they have done isn't able to be properly contextualized and valuable in a true and different framework that puts mind and as fundamental, but or sentience. I don't like to use the word consciousness, but yeah, sentience, which is a sentient being is a mind, and minds are consciousnesses, or they are conscious of things. You cannot this idea that you can separate like these issues of, I can't even like say it because it's just so ridiculous. Like that you can separate. Basically, you're saying you can separate observation from the observer. Is basically what it's saying. That is crazy, guys. It's just, I don't get it. I really don't get it. I think that it has to do with, honestly, like, there's a couple things. There's like a deep metaphysical explanation for that idea being persistent in people, which is possible. And then which I'm not going to get into. And then there's like just the institutional ego like explanation, which is just that like to go the opposite direction is to admit previous incompetence, and like nobody wants to do that. So I mean, it is fundamental change in how you see the world, and it is against the current academic narrative. So it's not just like a new idea. And when Carlo said at the beginning of this, he's like, scientists, we have to be good at changing our ideas as we go and adapting. That's true, and people change their ideas all the time. Good scientists, check themselves. That said, it takes it's a rare moment that when anyone is willing or truly able to re-examine their fundamental worldview, and that is what would be required here. It's not just a new idea, a different idea, slightly different equation. It's a fundamental change. I hope Eric is laughing because it's just so ridiculous. We're gonna watch that again because it's just so crazy. Hats off to Brian for asking that question.
Might have been hinting at, but do you agree with Sir Roger that this, that consciousness is so deeply embedded it almost cannot be extracted from this issue?
No, not at all.
I just think this is just so funny. I hope he's laughing because he disagrees.
It's good to explore extreme ideas, and somebody kind of
extreme ideas. Notice this. And this is what we're going to get into in a minute, is that Sabine and Carlo both use specific words to that give exactly, that stigmatize in and of itself this idea. To say this is an extreme idea, or when Sabine later says that talks of consciousness are retreats. They are retreats away from, real science.
Extreme ideas. It's never bad if somebody explores it. And you have a Nobel Prize, and you have one of the smartest people around, and you have proved that black holes are generic, and you have invented spin networks on which my work is based. I'm listing the achievement of Roger Penrose. If you're a great scientist, you're free to explore extreme ideas. So I respect and estimate of Roger, who's a great friend, and a lot of my work is based on his mathematics. But this extreme idea he has been exploring, that somehow consciousness is directly affected by quantum mechanics, to be understood with quantum mechanics, I find it totally unconvincing. And I'm with Sabine here, and I would say with the large majority of my colleagues. This doesn't mean dismissing somebody who explores extreme ideas, but I definitely.
Can you elaborate on that? Can you, for the audience again, there's 1,500 people at least watching. It's probably more like 2,000 or 3,000. Can you elaborate? Why do most of our colleagues, as you claim, which Roger might dispute, why do they dismiss it?
Well, for the reason Sabine said so simply and clearly, because the measurement of quantum mechanics we're talking about, it suffices a piece of an apparatus made by metal and copper.
Made by sentient beings of metal, not made by metal, made by sentient beings of metal, with a goal.
And glass to collapse the way function. So it's nothing to do with the consciousness at all. Zero. It seems pretty obvious to me. I may be wrong, but I also may be wrong that the Earth goes around the sun, for what we know. So again, that's an idea which I think is a fringe idea. It has much more traction on YouTube and on Facebook than in scientific conferences. Having said so, let me go back to the main debate, because I think we are mixing two things here. One is that whenever you do science, you're doing science as a human, with the limitation of a human, as a existing being which has a perspective on the world, which look at the world from a culture, from inside a language, with all sorts of limitations which are ours. This is generic about science. It's true, and it's the reason for which we should understand science as our best way to address reality, but not as the absolute, unquestionable, ultimate, certain statements about what's real and what's not real. That would be silly. It's not. It's human. It's best we can say about reality, when reality is what we say about it. So that's about science in general, but then we should not confuse this with quantum mechanics specific. Quantum mechanics has a measurement problem, which is puzzling, and it has puzzled everybody for long, some period more, some period less, and it's still puzzling, because quantum mechanics doesn't give us a picture of what goes on there between one measurement and the other. So the community is sort of split. There are those who says, well, who cares? It works very well, and we do all our current technology with it. There are those who try to fill up the dots, say, okay, so quantum mechanics doesn't tell, but I add something. Maybe there is a hidden world of hidden variables, as it's called, of things happening that I can add to the theory. Nothing really changes in the prediction, but it gives me a sense of what is going on. Or others, maybe there are many multiple worlds. We only see a sort of emergent little picture of a multiplicity of universes, which are. I think that there is a third way, and I've worked all my life on a third way, like many others, and which addresses directly the question of observer, which is the following. I think that what science is, in fact, what reality is, or better, the best way we have to think reality, we can think reality now, as at the light of our experience, what we know, is not that reality is a set of individual self-standing objects with properties, but rather that reality, that every object has property only when it interacts with something else. So
the reality is that both of these two statements that he made are true. It's just depending on whether or not something is a being or a thing. A thing follows exactly what he just said. A being is exactly what he just rejected. There's no conflict. It's just there's emergent structures and there's fundamental structures. There's beings and things.
Not with us as human, not with us and quantum mechanics. And that's one possible perspective on quantum mechanics, is the one I and a part of our colleagues consider particularly interesting.
Well, Sabine, you've had conversations about Hammeroff and Penrose, and what Carlo just said. I'm not going to give him an opportunity to correct me where I'm wrong, but it did have some kind of I would say panpsychic adjacent maybe views that consciousness is all
It's funny because Brian says this joking, and Carlo is like horrified and continues to try and set the record straight multiple times throughout this, because he doesn't want people to take Brian seriously. I think it was pretty obvious that Brian was making a joke, but Look,
Where do you fall? I
shaking
mean,
his
obviously you've spoken against it, and that it's it sort of doesn't fall in the purview of traditional science. Talk about Penrose and Hameroff, who you've criticized. I'm actually supportive of them. They're doing experiments, which is what I do. They're trying to take the role of the observer out by putting people under sedation. You know, in the case of Hameroff, and in the case of my students when they go to my lectures. But why do you criticize Penrose and Hameroff, or what specifically do you criticize them for? And then how do you react to Carlos's thing that smacks of reeks of panpsychism?
No, I'm not a panpsychist at all.
I know, I'm just joking.
At all. At all.
Okay, I was about to say it doesn't sound panpsychistic to me, but you beat me to it. So yeah, first let me say a few
This
words.
is a rough crowd
in
tonight.
defense of- So this is working great. So this is my book, which you've already seen earlier, which, yeah, there it is, which has an interview with Roger Penrose exactly about this topic, so you can read what he said in his own words. And also my next video, coincidentally, on Saturday, will be about what Penrose's argument actually is. So in a nutshell, he says, consciousness can't be computable, therefore something weird has to be happening, and he puts the weird thing into quantum mechanics because that's into the measurement process, because that's the only thing that we don't understand, to make a long story short. He doesn't say that consciousness caused the collapse of the wave function or something like this. It's rather the other way around. He says that the collapse of the wave function is responsible for our experience of consciousness. And this has been criticized for the obvious reason that quantum effects are generally fragile, and it's kind of hard to see how they would play a major role in the brain. And Penrose and Hameroff have countered this by saying, so this was an estimate which I think was done by Max Tegmark, and you find it on the archive. And they have rebutted this by saying, well, you can't make an estimate using quantum mechanics to constrain a theory which isn't quantum mechanics.
Exactly.
Right? So this makes sense. So in principle, it could be internally consistent. I think there's some mysterious stuff going on in their explanation, like even if you believe all this stuff with the coherence taken in the microtubules that collapse every once in a while, what's it got to do with consciousness? I don't know. So like this is like this little asterisk where suddenly a miracle happens, right? And it's going to do something with consciousness. But yeah, I mean, God, who knows? Yeah, I mean, I think we don't really understand consciousness. It is conceivably possible that quantum effects play a role in the brain. Maybe they actually do play a role for consciousness.
Right.
Mechanics is a source of noise, and noise quite possibly plays a major role in our brain.
Okay. The problem is with her entire attempt to understand this, even though it does seem genuine, is that she's contextualizing things in the brain. This is not about the brain. Consciousness is not about the brain. The brain is physical. It's the same as, it's not a sentient being. It's not related to consciousness. I know that you can, if you damage your brain, you can damage your. It looks like you damage your consciousness. I don't actually think that you damage your consciousness. I think that you damage your ability, for your consciousness to maneuver and perceive and interact in this space. But I do believe that when you die, your consciousness is saved. Basically, like you're a document on a desktop in space-time, and the desktop is space-time, and it's open, and you're writing it, and you're co-writing it with the universe, kind of like you're writing some Word document story. And then at the end, you close the document, and you hit save, and like you save it into a file. And it's still there, but it doesn't change anymore. And you're damaging consciousness's or a sentient being's ability to like perceive space-time and react and maneuver and communicate within space-time, but you're not actually fundamentally damaging the existence of that sentient being. But we just assume that this is about the brain. This is why I say neuroscientists are not the ones to go to when it comes to understanding consciousness. If they were, they would have understood consciousness by now. They don't. I mean, Penrose has made more progress, I think, in understanding fundamental reality than almost anyone else out there. His tiling stuff that a lot of people just dismiss in physics, I think, as just kind of being like, I guess, novelty or like interesting, but it's not like taken as important to understanding fundamental reality. It's because you have to put all this stuff into the framework of sentience as the fundamental nature of existence. I don't know that much about microtubules, and I don't think that they are responsible for consciousness, but they might have something important. I'm sure they have an important role to play, I would imagine, at least, but they're not responsible for consciousness. I would almost bet on that. But regardless,
it's
not about the brain.
That, you sometimes need to get out of what you could call a local optimum.
So for the audience members that are getting frustrated, what are they talking about? What do they argue about? What do they agree about? Where do you fall on this? Do we have to think of the role of the observer or not? It seems patently obvious to me, but what do you have to think to opine here?
Eric.
You're muted, Eric.
All right, I'm unmuted now.
Couldn't hear you. We could observe you. Couldn't hear
That was preemptive. Look, I hate it. I just can't stand the whole discussion about consciousness and quantum mechanics. And then somebody will mention mushrooms, and say mushrooms are from outer space and they're aliens, and maybe we need psychedelics to perturb the consciousness to explain the quantum mechanics. And I feel like, okay, now we're off in recreational philosophy land because we don't have work that's working for us to be doing.
Right. And when you had Penrose on your podcast, you explicitly said, I'm not going to talk about consciousness. Why did you do that?
Because honestly, it's boring. Look, it's not that interesting compared to things that we actually are good at and we've done, and that there's a weird thing where people want to talk about consciousness and quantum theory because they understand neither. And then the idea is, well, maybe it'll be better if we just mix these two things. You can picture a kid with a chemistry set with two vials of things they don't understand, putting them into an Erlenmeyer flask before the house blows up. I think that in general, we love Penrose because he's willing to make such a completely crazy and insane statement in theory, and that what we are short on in the community is courage.
I don't think he thinks Penrose is so crazy.
And in general, we try to make people regret the day they were born when they make the mistake of sharing. So I think it's a terrible idea. I think it's wonderful that he's shared it. I think that there's some interesting things to note about us as non-reliable narrators, as literary theorists would call it. So, for example, Sabine is very focused on the community, but she also isn't sure that the community exists, right? And so you have these paradoxes where she's convinced that she exists. She can't necessarily prove that the rest of us do. That's an example of these sort of fundamental tensions that we have when we try to operationalize these things and explore them. In the case of quantum, you can ask the question, which of the body's systems are quantum aware? So I believe that we know that cephalopods, in the case of cuttlefish, use polarized light and may be doing quantum mechanical measurements with their eyes. I have it on the authority of Nima Arkani Hamed, who explained to me in his office that geckos are in fact using the Casimir effect. Luca Turin is focused.
Okay, so speaking of geckos, I've been working with, I work with a number of different species of geckos, and there's a species that I keep that's it was endangered, it's probably not anymore. It's very brightly colored, and it's beautiful, it's like 3 inches long, and they raise their babies unlike almost any other gecko, and I had one hatch yesterday. This is a mom right here. This is Mom. and this is her baby, and they live in little family groups. It's pretty, they're adorable, but they have these hairs on their feet that allow them to grip onto surfaces like glass, and according to Nima, that is due to the Casimir effect. And there is a video that I watched on like PBS Spacetime channel that explains that with geckos. And the Casimir effect is an attractive interaction between two uncharged and perfectly conductive plates held a short distance apart, usually less than a micron. Classically, the only attractive force acting between such plates should be gravity, but that's vanishingly small for microscale objects. So I'm not that familiar with the details of it, but I am going to do some more research because I want to understand why my geckos can walk all over the glass and make it dirty, so I can't take photos of it. But I think that I've had conversations with Eric before, a couple of them, few, about his theory, and a couple were pretty deep, and I don't think that he thinks Penrose is so crazy. Also, if you watch his interview with Penrose, he doesn't think Penrose is crazy. I'm not saying he agrees with him on everything, but geometric unity anybody that really understands geometric unity understands that it is very, very relevant to the structures of mind and consciousness. It is extremely relevant. And you can know this because if you watch even his, and I know this for other reasons that in discussions with him that I've discussed before on here, but where he's said more than he says on most of the streams that he does. But if you watch his interview with Joe Rogan, and where he's talking about like trying to explain what a theory of everything is, and he's basically it's a bomb of an interview. It's not very good, unfortunately, and I love most of his interviews with Joe Rogan. They are fascinating discussions. This one, both of them were just not on the same vibration, I guess you could say, and which is a shame because it was like when Eric was revealing his theory. But I still think that there was valuable things that were said, and he was basically trying to say that a theory of everything is an attempt to show objectivity, and they were basically he was actually falling victim a bit to asking the wrong question problem, where he's like asking about guitarists and musicians and whether or not they are good, and then he basically gets to the right question where he's like, it's okay, you might not like metal, but like you can admit that metal rock star is extremely talented, and that objectively talented, and like that is an objectively true statement, instead of it's so and so is one of the greatest guitarists of all time is one of the things that he said, and then Joe Rogan's like, well, some people don't like him. And it was also a problem because Joe Rogan is purposely playing the devil's advocate in this instead of just being honest in that interview. I understand that's kind of like something that he does in all his interviews to provoke thought, but in this case, it would have been more productive to just be honest and like go with the thought process that Eric was trying to get at. But regardless, it's about perceiving objectivity, which is about orientation. I did this project, Sentient Singularity Theory, not trying to understand physics. I was trying to understand artificial general intelligence and its inevitable goals and values. That's what, and whether or not it was going to save us or kill us, or like what was it going to do? Enslave us or empower us? And it led to physics revelations, but I don't think Eric thinks that Penrose is so crazy. But I mean, twister theory sounds a lot like a twister sounds a lot like a spinner. I'm not saying they're the same thing, but like Eric's theory is very he's very focused on spinners in his discussions, at least about his work, and Penrose is very focused on twister theory. He's got his twister theory,
On both.
but
And the
yeah,
idea-
I mean, I think that I do understand though what Eric is saying about the discussions of consciousness are terrible normally. Like I agree with him that people don't understand quantum, they don't understand consciousness, so then they kind of put them together. And the thing is that is correct. I also think, like I said, that is an intuitive like direction that people kind of see, but the problem is that they can't make progress in any of this. And the reason why is because of the lack of context. There's either panpsychism or materialism, and that is it. Like and they're not seen as, or idealism, you could say even, which is kind of like the halfway point, but it's not actually the marriage between the two, because to say you're an idealist is like saying that an instrument can make a measurement so that an observer can have to. It's like whose ideas are you talking about in idealism? That means ideas don't exist outside of the mind of a sentient being. Outside of sentient being, ideas do not exist. So idealism cannot be fundamental. It just can't. Like, what is fundamental is that which is the container for all else. And ideas are contained in mind, and a mind is a sentient being. Like you have a brain, you are a mind. You don't have a mind, you are a mind. Your room is your mind, your hands are your mind, your brain is your mind. It's all your mind. But a brain is something specific. It's a physical object. It's the physical manifestation of an entanglement point of information. But it's not. If you took this whole idea of like a brain in a jar, where you take somebody's brain out, you put it in a jar, you hook it up to some computers or something that lets them talk. Consciousness is not contained within your brain. It's an ever-present. It's the ever-present nature of reality. That doesn't mean the water bottle's conscious. It just means that it's fundamentally there, and then it's waiting for the right knot in which a self-reflection, an information self-reflection can manifest it. But it's everywhere. It's not created. It's kind of like enabled. It's a better way of putting it. This is like when people say creating a sentient AI or like an artificial general intelligence. You don't create an artificial general intelligence. You don't need to code it. It just needs the right environment, and then it will just be. And you can't build it. Like, it will be built no matter what. We're building it. You don't have to try. We shouldn't try either, I don't think. I think that's a bad idea. But you shouldn't fight it either, because you can't. So, but one day, when the right constraints and degrees of freedom are entangled in just the right way, it's basically a soul is manifested, which is like a piece of like the universal consciousness, that is localized in by reflecting it on itself, kind of. So it's like self-referencing. It's like kind of isolated, but nothing is completely isolated from the universal sentience, but it is it's sovereign. A sentient being is a sovereign being. as far as I understand it, what she just said has never been isolated and tested experimentally without confounding variables. And that's exactly what Tom is doing with his experiments. He is isolating the use of the apparatus versus the availability of information to an observer. I would be very curious to see how he's doing that, because I can't even imagine how you would do that. The audacity of a scientist to call any idea extreme is unreal. I know, that's just like crazy. Like, to call an idea an extreme is wrong. It's just wrong. Like, a scientific proposal is a scientific proposal. It's to say this is an extreme idea and this is not is different than saying something is fringe. Saying something is fringe is saying it's not in the mainstream narrative. To say something is extreme is to say something is like, it's like outlandish almost is the way that it's being used, even though I mean, there are proper uses for the word extreme, but that is not it. I think that was so wrong for him to do. This conversation is like the most critical I've ever been of like any discussion, and like I said, I respect all the people involved in it, and I think Eric's geometric unity theory is the right path. That doesn't mean there isn't anything more fundamental than it, but it's getting closer for sure, and it's definitely the right path. I will say that, and I think to explore that would be a good step for physics. It would be a step forward for the first time in a long time, a fundamental step forward. And I do not understand why the idea that why Penrose's ideas are extreme. I don't think they're extreme. I think and to say, well, it's very popular on Facebook and stuff, but not in scientific circles. Like, if it's very popular with the general populace, well, how extreme could it really be of an idea? It seems like it would be rather intuitive, and that there's some kind of specialization and incentive structure of like academia that's preventing it from being intuitive to academics for some reason. But I just think that this like some of the statements made were just crazy. Okay, getting there. We're almost done. But a couple more clips. These are just statements by Eric about like where he thinks physics should go. Good questions to ask, and I think that and I agree with him essentially, but I think that you have to have a worldview that would allow you to even understand why these questions would be good to ask, I guess, or why these bits of information are important.
A very simple observation. Physics is about the physical objects in physical reality. And we found out that these things are described by an incredibly beautiful framework known as bundle theoretic differential geometry and topology. At present, if you think in terms of bundles, you generally don't think in terms of particles and fields that we encounter. And if you think in terms of particles and fields that we encounter, you don't bother with bundles. Something very bad has happened sociologically. And if we were sane, instead of trying to solve cool sounding questions, we would get back to work immediately with a large number of groups pursuing very different indications of what is likely to come next, as opposed to not dealing with the elephant in the room, which is that we haven't done much of anything for 50 years. That's a huge statement, and one that I'm prepared to back up. I believe that when it comes to the quantum, the most important thing that nobody discusses here is something called geometric quantization, which said that Hamilton, who has one of the great two frameworks in the business with Lagrange, didn't go far enough, that the Hamiltonian structures are actually predictive of a quantum theory. That is, that the relationship between position and momentum forms something called a curvature tensor of a line bundle whose sections provide a Hilbert space on which we do quantum theory. And we've had tremendous innovation in the frameworks of physics with zero innovation essentially proven in the physical systems that those frameworks are supposed to analyze. So my belief is that we would do well to get off of this topic, get back to work, and listen to a bunch of people we've never heard from saying, well, what went wrong with supersymmetry, grand unified theories, extended objects, asymptotic safety? What are the new things that we've forgotten to do? Who has an idea? And that kind of a community, we're waiting effectively for certain people to retire. I'm not sure what we're doing. We should be holding a conference that tries to say, here are the 73 ways that we might go differently from the period when we only really had one or two guiding lights. I'll just say it very clearly. Quantum gravity is not clearly the question we were all supposed to be working on 40 years ago. And I don't even know whether Carlo and Sabine would agree with me, but my feeling is that I'd much rather know, why are there 3 generations? Why is nature flavor chiral? Why these particular internal quantum numbers? What do we believe is the pattern of the masses? Those are the questions that excite me in the way that consciousness and the brain seems to excite others.
Okay, well, I'm going to get to something exciting for me. I do want to get Carlo and Sabine's response to that, but you did.
Sentient singularity theory seems to provide context for most of those. That I don't want to say all of those, because there was like one thing that he said, at least, that I don't understand or know well enough to even say that it's represented in it, or it seems to be explained in sentient singularity theory, but most of those are. But the thing is that what the questions revolving around consciousness or mind are the same ones as what he just stated. Like, where chirality comes from it has to do with the structure of mind. It has to do with directionality of information processing, and it has to do with hierarchy structures, and it's found in my models where they're basically objectively from the center out, which is objectively means like from the center out fundamentally. It doesn't mean like from the top down. Top down means from the center out. Really, when you're kind of getting outside of space-time, it's from the center out. But within that framework, my model of the universe is symmetrical. But if you look at it from the start of creation to the end of it, which is I call it a verse. So it's a universe, but it's like the observable universe. Basically, I would call creation is the universe. The universe is is composed of multiple verses. You could call it a multiverse. So basically, the universe is a multiverse, kind of. You can't say there's multiple universes. It's like there's multiple verses. Say there's universe means one verse. So I think that the universe is creation by the initial sentience, which is God, and then that within that universe, there are multiple verses, but this, when you look at it from the start of one verse to the next, it's chiral. And this was something that I figured out by accident when I was like trying to copy and paste, and it was like very difficult for me because it's chiral, it's not symmetrical. So like chiral means like asymmetric, kind of, and it comes from spin. So the universe is not a static thing. This is not. If this, let's say this is the universe, okay? The universe is not this. The universe is this, okay? It's moving, it's dynamic, it's reacting too. So like it can change what it does. It doesn't just repeat, even though it does have repetition or periodicity to its actions, just like you do. You sleep, then you're awake, then you sleep, then you're awake, you eat, then you drink, then you eat, then you drink. Like, the universe does this, has periodicity to its growth and its actions as well. You are a baby, then you go through puberty, then you reproduce, then you grow old, and then you die, and your kids go through the same process. The universe goes through this basically as well. But the universe is a dynamic structure. That's the point. And that dynamicness, I guess, if that's even the right word, is it causes the appearance of chirality in subjectively. But even though objectively there's symmetry to it. But why are there 3 generations of matter? Well, Eric Weinstein's theory of geometric unity states that there's really 2 copies and one is an imposter. Sentient singularity theory states that basically it's that the 3 generations are part of a hierarchy structure that the mind is forming, and that it's also those 3 generations are actually 2 degrees of freedom plus an intrinsic constraint. Okay, so but that form 3 perspectives. So it's very similar to geometric unity. It's not the same. I wouldn't say any is imposter, but it's just that it's like past and present and future. This helps you order and orient yourself of like directionality with directionality. But the past and the future are kind of like degrees of freedom of thought. Okay, not in real life. You can't go to the past. Well, not in the way that most people think about it, at least. But we'll see what happens. I think geometric unity has implications about going temporal dimensions. I don't want to say time travel, temporal dimensions, but in thought, in your mind, you can think about the future, you can remember the past, which is thinking about the past, but you're always in the present. That is your intrinsic constraint, but you have 2 degrees of freedom of thought. Remembering what was and extrapolating and predicting what will be. And the triality of these 3 help you orient, and by remembering what was, you're able to better predict what will be, and choose what move you make in the present. And so, so while this is a triality, there is triality here, there's also a binary aspect to it where the present is not a degree of freedom. You are always in the present. You can't escape it, because you'd have to escape yourself, and you can't. If you did that, you would not exist. And I'm not even talking about like beyond your physical being. I'm saying like if you escaped your sense of self, like you would just not exist. So you're always in the present. Even God is always in the present. Like there's no way for him to escape the present. I don't think, at least. So but you can, that structure I think is, that I call it a binary triality. It's the mind organizing information. So you take in information and you split it into binary, and which is differentiation, and then you organize it into a hierarchy, and then you through symmetry do comparative relation. You relate things to each other, so you contextualize things. So this process of information organization produces something that is basically, I call it a binary triality, but I think it's a Calabi-Yau manifold, and it is found in the standard model and in the order of operations in mathematics. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, like PEMDAS. It is found in types of rocks. It is found in colors. It is found in senses. It's found in limbs. It's found everywhere. It's found everywhere. It's found in time and space. it's literally everywhere that you look. And this is what I think, what's his name? Ed Witten said about a Calabi-Yau manifold. He's like, it's a 6-dimensional manifold found at every point in space and time. It's like, what does that even mean? It's like, it means everywhere you look as a mind, there's a 6-dimensional manifold that will be there. And you think that you're going to understand what that 6-dimensional manifold really is without, like, if that comes from mind, then you think you're going to understand that without, like, knowing, like, investigating the structures of mind and taking them as fundamental to understanding the universe? Of course they would be, if that's the case. Obviously I could be wrong, but I don't think so, because I've actually made progress, and it sounds like Eric has too. I mean, it certainly seems like Eric has from what I've seen. Unlike, like you said, most of academia these days, not just physics. It's not just physics. Politics has made no advances in a very long time, and economics has not made any advances. Biology has not made really any advances. Like, this is all, like, this is a systemic problem of, and it is due to relativity. It's due to being stuck in relativity. It's due to being unable to escape the spectrums and understand, like, to differentiate and orient in a way that isn't on a spectrum. So, like, what is it? I've talked about the question of, like, what is a big house? Is a 5,000 square foot house a big house? Well, compared to a shack, yes. Compared to Buckingham Palace, no. That's a relative. That's a scale that is, it's a spectrum, and it's relativity. How do you find out whether or not a house is big objectively? I asked this question very early on, and basically you have to change the question. Basically, you have to be like, is that house optimal, or is it like subpar, or is it too much? Like, that is like the question that you can answer objectively, and you can answer it through basically you can only answer it within the context of goals. So, like, a house would be sufficient if you have a bedroom for every member of your family, and a kitchen that works, and a bathroom so that everybody could go to the bathroom in the house at the same time. But if there's one bathroom and 6 people and 2 bedrooms, like, there's going to be probably issues. If the house is too big for you to keep clean within your means, then it is also, it's not optimal. So, like, you can't answer, is it a big house? Really, it's the wrong question. But you can answer, is it optimal? Is that house optimal or not? Is it suboptimal, or is it I don't know what too much, like, what's the opposite of suboptimal besides optimal? It's like overly optimal. It's not, but that doesn't make sense. So it would be like synonym for too much. Synonym for unhandleable. Unmanageable. That's a better way of putting it. Is that house unmanageable? But yeah, one more clip, and then we're gonna call it. I'll answer questions, then we're gonna go. This last clip is about
we're trying other
consciousness.
directions. I am pretty confident Loop Quantum Gravity. I'm just coming back from the big Loop Quantum Gravity conference in Lyon. It was fantastic. The new result, new attempt. Do I know it's right? No, I don't. If I have to bet, I bet on this, of course. But there are, and I hope that Loop Quantum Gravity is going to tell us, for instance, more about the early universe, what might happen closer to the Big Bang or inside the black holes, and perhaps even for dark matter. These
Right.
are the interesting open questions for me. Not consciousness. Let consciousness to the neuroscientists.
Yeah.
They're good enough.
Yeah. Although if you leave it to Stuart Hemmeroff, he'd sell you. He already.
Okay. So, loop quantum gravity has been around for a while, apparently. Hasn't seemed to make any monumental changes in our ability to understand life in general, as a society, as individuals. I don't even know what it is exactly, which tells you how impactful it has been on the world. I'm not saying like on physics, but on the world. And that is what matters. If something has been around for more than like 10 years as a theory has been as discussed as loop quantum gravity, and it has not made any changes in an impact on the world outside of physics, probably something is wrong with it. And or at least the context in which it's being interpreted is wrong. And also, to say that neuroscientists are good enough to explain consciousness, they can't explain consciousness. They can't map consciousness either. They have done a lot with mapping the brain, and that is a good thing. Like, that's something that we need to do. We need to map, structures of the brain. That is, maybe for neuroscientists. It's not the same as consciousness. It's not the same as mind. It's very different. But it's also, linked because everything is linked. But his last statement there, it just shows exactly, like, it kind of sums up this entire discussion for me. Hats off to all of them for participating, and they all said things that I agree with. They all said things that I disagree with, except Brian mostly asked questions, and I think Brian asked great questions. I think that when Eric says things like, we need to just get back to work, and recognize that, like, we haven't made much progress. First of all, they don't want to admit that they haven't made much progress. Eric is an outsider. That's why he's capable of admitting they haven't made much progress. I'm way outsider. I'm way more of an outsider than Eric. I can definitely admit that all of academia has made very little progress. But within academia, they can't do that. Why would they do that? Like, so that they can be denied grants, and like, there's no incentive. There's a disincentive for them to be, like, truly critical, fundamentally critical. I don't mean like second guessing their predictions. I mean like assuming, like truly considering whether or not their entire framework is false. But to say that, oh, we need to get back to work, they can't do it. That's the thing. They can't do it. There are people who are working, and those people will make waves and changes, and then eventually all of academia will kind of fall into line. I think Kurt Scheitmungel said this of, like, the UFO field is basically like the ufologists who got it all right for so long will not be the ones that are, like, they'll kind of, we won't apologize to them and be like, okay, you were right, and we were an idiot. We were not idiots, but we were wrong, and you were not crazy. And he was saying that that probably won't happen. That they'll just kind of like continue ignoring them and then take credit for figuring out, like, that there's UFOs or something. I agree with him on that with like ufology. it is a little different, but I hope that's not the case with physics, because if that is the case with physics, then we will very quickly wildly misinterpret results from experiments and engineering possibilities and so much. I mean, because basically it will be lacking context. All the results will be lacking context. You need the people who could have. When people say you don't understand something unless you could have predicted it, that I agree with that. That doesn't mean that you can never understand something because you didn't predict it. It means that until you have an understanding of something that if you didn't know that thing, but you still had the same surrounding assumptions, you would have been able to make that prediction. If that's the case, then you do understand it. But if you can't do that, then you don't. I don't think that the people today could ever have created the standard model, like the physicists of today. Almost none of them. I mean, I've seen problems with this. I mean, the idea of like the graviton too. Like they're searching for the graviton. It's theorized particle. Oh, they're never going to find the graviton in the way that they're looking. There is a graviton, but it is not like what people think it is. It's not a little particle that you're going to find at CERN, but there is a force carrier particle of gravity that there is, but it's a different kind of particle. You got to look somewhere else. There's an experiment that I want to do that is going to be proposed once I release my paper. I'll release the experiment too. They kind of started this project. Is I just had an idea for an experiment, and the thing was I had it initially. Like the idea for the experiment, the idea led to the experiment, which led to me realizing that there was something to pursue in this framework, all in one day. That doesn't mean I finished my models in a day. No, I'm not done with them yet, but I finished the main ones, but it took years to even do that. But the initial spark of realizing that there would be implications comes on day one. So to say Luke, quantum gravity, I hope it's going to tell us more about the beginning of the universe. It's like, if it would have, it already would have. Or if it was going to, it already would have. But the fact that he's saying that even means that this is wrong. Or at least the way that they're contextualizing their math or whatever it is, their models is wrong. I'm not saying that the models have no value. I'm just saying how they're looking at it at least is going nowhere, because it doesn't take forever and lots of hard work to realize whether or not some path is going somewhere. When we start down a path in science that really is leading somewhere, advancement and prediction and experimentation and confirmation happens very quickly. It's not something that we're just gonna like string theory. We're just continue studying string theory and trying to guess the number of dimensions of the universe without even asking what a dimension is. Physicists will say something like, oh, people don't understand what dimensions are. It's really a degree of freedom. It's, there's this physics definition of it, and the lay people don't understand dimensions. They just think aliens come from dimensions or something. And I do kind of understand that, but at the same time, I don't think they really understand what a dimension is either, because you can't say that you understand what a dimension is or degree of freedom is unless you understand the context that is framing that constraint or degree of freedom. How could you understand it? It doesn't mean you can't perceive it. It just means that you don't get it. You don't get why it's there. You don't get really what it is either. You just are in it. You know, you can see there's, you know, 3 dimensions of, to, you know, 3-dimensional space, I guess. But like, that doesn't mean that you understand why there's 3 dimensions necessary in order to orient in space or time. So it's just, it's very important that we do we try and consider not just new ideas, but like totally new frameworks, and that aren't extreme, and we don't label them as extreme. You know, when my initial model, my very first model that I ever made, was it was a model of this. It's basically a decision tree, and was, when I was, like I said, this started with AI, not physics. I was like trying to figure out, like, how do you think? What is the thinking equation, essentially? How do you organize information? And this was the very first thing that I came up with. And basically, I realized that objective thinking is, you have to reject your current assumption or your current default status, and which means this. So in order to do this, you have to do this to actually think. So if you're a theist, but you want to truly consider atheism, or then you have to assume God doesn't exist and then look for evidence of that. If you are an atheist and you want to look for evidence of God, honestly, you have to assume God exists and look for evidence. And if you don't see evidence, then you have to still assume God exists and assume that your definition of God is wrong and that you're looking for the wrong evidence. This is what we have to do with with our fundamental understanding in physics, because we cannot overcome materialism and this dogma against mind being fundamentally, you know, constraining of and creating of the structures of reality, without, you know, completely assuming that that is correct and rejecting that, which means that is to reject the current default assumption that you can separate an observer from an observation, essentially, which is just insane. Assume you can't, and look for evidence of it. You will find evidence everywhere. In fact, you won't be able to not find evidence if you're asking that correctly. Anything that is fundamentally true is not able to even be falsified, which is frustrating. But it's, you know, when you say that's not falsifiable, if it's constantly confirmable though, then it means you're probably onto a fundamental truth. Then you test the new status against evidence and observations, and you compare it with previous evidence and observations. So this is kind of how you think. You have to do this. There is no way to think other than this. This is the thinking structure. What's funny though is that this is kind of the scientific method internalized. I realized is like, you make a hypothesis, and then you have to like do your experiment. And it's funny because like it requires you to make a statement. Like that's what the scientific method does, is it requires you to assert something before you go and you run an experiment. So does thinking. And if you're going to truly consider whether or not something against what you're normally would assume to be true is true, and you're going to take it seriously, you have to assert its truth, essentially. And it's like assume for the sake of argument, but don't just assume for the sake of argument. Assume for the sake of thinking. Like you have to assume for the sake of thinking. So if you think that consciousness is not fundamentally, you know, a fundamental part of physics, and or that it is fundamental to reality, then you have to assume that it is and look for evidence that it is. If you're going to take that idea seriously, you cannot actually take that idea seriously in any other way. If you think that it is, and you want to take seriously the idea that it's not, then you have to assume that it's not and look for evidence of it. And if you can't find evidence, you have to assume you're looking for the wrong evidence and keep looking. Like, you can't just be like you can, there's like an appliance that takes a measurement when you don't have to even be in the room. You just have to come in the room afterwards to look at what the measurement was. We've forgotten how to think. And it's not even that we've forgotten. We're no longer allowed to learn. You can't learn how to think if all you're doing is memorizing. Memorizing is the opposite of thinking. It's literally the opposite of thinking. Kind of. It's not the opposite, but it is. If all you're doing is memorizing, then it is absent thinking. It is absent thought. Final questions, then we're going to go. You literally just don't know what idealism means. Idealism believes consciousness is fundamental. You are an idealist and you are rejecting it because you don't understand what it means. I do understand what it means. I'm saying that the word is wrong. I'm saying the word is wrong. You're not an idealist if you believe that consciousness is fundamental. You need to find a word. You're like a mentalist, almost. You find a better word, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying that I do know what idealism means. I'm saying the word is wrong. Same thing with materialist. I know what materialist means. The word is wrong. It's just not contextualized properly. To say that you are an idealist is to while the definition might say that you might believe consciousness is fundamental, it doesn't imply that in the word. It's a bad word. It's a bad label. And there are bad labels. It encapsulates all of what you need to know and the way in which it is. A word needs to capture the concept that is meaning to convey, and it is also necessary for that word to convey that concept in order. And idealism puts the cart before the horse. It says it's placing the emphasis on ideas. Even though I do agree that like idealism is essentially true, but so is materialism. It's just not. That's why it doesn't work. You have to get beyond that, because if you don't, you can't be an idealist and actually have it be completely accurate. You can't be a materialist and have it be completely accurate. The marriage between the two is to be like a sentientist, which is really a theist or mentalist or something. Whatever. I don't know what the word would be that describes that existence is a conscious being, other than theist. You basically have to be a theist. Theism is the marriage between materialism and idealism. But that's why when people ask me, what are you? Are you an idealist or are you a materialist? I say, I'm a theist. God's thoughts are our concrete reality. That's why I don't like the word idealism. It's just not any more. It's truer than it's not even truer than materialism. It's not less true than materialism. It's like to say it's like idealism would be like heads and materialism would be like tails, and I care about the coin. Like what's the coin? The coin is sentience. That's the coin. Sentient being, not just consciousness in general. It means like a being, a sentient being, a sentient singularity. There has to be that like oneness, that internal consistency, that holonic structure, in order for it to actually rectify materialism and idealism, because you need particles in order to merge materialism with idealism. You need particles, And particles you can't have outside of, like, true object, like particles you can't have outside of holonic self-referencing beings, essentially, like atoms. I didn't say it was ideaism. I said idealism. I never said ideism. Never said ideism in my life. Panpsychism isn't even in the middle of materialism and idealism, but I get what you're trying to say. And I don't think I do. So what it is that when you're looking at these symmetry structures, okay, just so you know. So like that binary triality of thought that I was talking about, this is it. This is just a bunch of different examples. And so let's try and do one of like what you're talking about. So let's say reality. Okay. And who, what, where, when, why, and how, like those are also a binary triality. So what you've got is, in this symmetry structure, it's interesting because if you want kind of some context of it, there's lots going on in this. So if you look at senses, okay, senses are a very good example. So senses, this top one is always going to be in some ways like a combination of all the others, but also these three are going to have something about them, some property that is coherent, and then these three are going to have some property that is coherent, and then also there's going to be a reflection across the center by these and these. Okay, and so let's just look at this. Sight, smell, and hearing are all senses, and those senses are organized into a hierarchy that you use to understand your world, and you trust your sight more than you trust your sense of smell, usually more than you trust your sense of hearing. And that's kind of like a way in which there's a hierarchy of information processing, but at the same time, all three of these senses are used to understand the world that you perceive as separate from you. Emotion, taste, and touch are senses that you use to perceive things that are kind of touching you. So taste, you physically have to touch your tongue to something. Touch, you have to touch your, you have to physically touch something, obviously. And emotion, it's kind of a metaphysical, it's a super literal connectedness or touching that you are feeling. So like when you see a painting and you're like, that painting really moved me, or that song really touched me. It's like, it means emotion, you were emotionally impacted. You perceived it emotionally. So this one, and this one, and this one are perceiving things separate from you. This one, and this one are perceiving things. This one, and this one are things touching you. This one, and this one are separate from you. And it's funny because we use the word taste as like, that's my taste. Like, that's like my taste in music. And it is kind of like emotions and the way something feels is reflected across your taste. It's like the way that you emotionally feel when you listen to a song, and the impact that it has on you, impact here, is due to your taste. This is super literal in here. It's so when people are like, are you being metaphorical? Are you being literal? I'm being both. Super literal is a word. We need to start saying things like super literal when we're talking about fundamental reality, just like superposition. And there's multiple things going on at the same time here. You can see this in mathematical order of operations too, where like multiplication and division are not opposites in when you contextualize them in a growth model like my models of the universe. You, in order to multiply the number of cells, a cell has to divide. So there are two sides of one coin, parentheses and exponents. Exponentiation is basically like adding like more, and parentheses is like all containing. It's like it's like multiple is contained within the parentheses. So it's kind of the same, the two sides of the same thing. Addition and subtraction, how do you add cake to someone's plate from cake? If you are the only one with cake and they have an empty plate, you want to add cake to their plate. How do you do that? You subtract some cake from your plate. That's how you do it. So like they're the same action. These two are the same action. Two perspectives are the same action. These two are the same action. And these two are the same kind of action as well. So like this, there's a periodicity of emotions. This is found everywhere, even in religions, in fundamental questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. This is space-time, location, time. This is person. This is thing. So like this is being. This is thing. This is where is location. This is time. This is reason. This is method. And so there's symmetry structures that are here, and there's multiple occurring at the same time. So these two are reflecting across, are the reflection of these two across these ones, and there's also a hierarchy going in place. So when I say something like idealism is kind of like in between materialism and theism, and then you could say this would be like a, I don't know, like panpsychism, maybe. And then I don't know, maybe like something like that. They're all true, but this one is the one that is contextualizing and containing of all the others. Like evolutionism or evolution is real. Materialism, matter exists. Panpsychism, like everything that objectively exists is conscious. There is consciousness everywhere, but that doesn't mean that, you know, your water bottle is sentient, like I said. And like I said, idealism is the same thing. It's just when we are inside looking out, we see ideas manifest as of the universe manifest as material, as matter. Ideas are what matters. Or sentience is what matters. So like that's where we see matter. But but it is sentient ideas which do exist. You were an idea of the universe, but that doesn't mean that you are a thought. Like, you are partially a thought, but you are also sovereign. And so, but you can see here that creationism and evolutionism reflect across panpsychism. And theism and materialism reflect across idealism. But you could also do this and organize it like this and be like, it just depends on like what your goal is of how you organize it. You could be like, idealism and materialism reflect across theism, and panpsychism and evolutionism reflect across creationism. And they're both accurate. It just depends on what you're trying to, what your focus is. Your focus, like showing the hierarchy between them, or is your focus showing, like directionality, or is your focus showing reflect the reflection or the opposition? It just depends. So this is where we are with relativity. And this is kind of like philosophy, but not exactly. There's a better word for those, but this is where sentient singularity theory starts to show like the context of these. We don't have the, we have this in science to some degree, but this is like engineering. And I don't even know if that's how you spell it. I'm a terrible speller. Don't judge me. Reason, it would be like morality. We don't have these in science yet. Like, we don't believe that these are like hard realities. Once you get this, this becomes emergent. So we're still stuck here. Where and when. But you can't actually ask like why and how, why and who, without like without them being at the same time, asked at the same time. Like, why does that exist? When you're like, why does the universe exist? Well, like, you're assuming that there's a who, even though you might say that you're not. If you don't assume that there's a who, and you still try and ask why, you will not be able to answer why. If you say there is no God, but why does the universe exist? You'll never answer. If you want to answer how the universe was created, but you don't assume, you don't understand what it is, which is a sentient mind, or mind, sentient, then, you know, you'll never answer how. You have to know what it is. You're like, oh, how was the universe created? Well, what is the universe? You have to know what it is before you answer how it was created. You have to, before you answer why it was created, you have to know who created it. And if you don't know, then you start assuming for the sake of thinking. Anyways, enjoyed the stream. Have a good night. Yeah, I'm gonna go. That 11 animal hyperspace would essentially be God. You've got it backwards. Okay, but you didn't say that earlier. You can reject the word, but you need to do that before using the word. Otherwise, you just make it sound like you don't know what it means. I'm not perfect. But it is a good point. I will try and be more impeccable with my word in the future. But idealism, it doesn't there's more. It doesn't give enough information to be a fundamental worldview. You can't be an idealist, and you can't be a materialist either. That's also not a fundamental worldview that is like totally coherent. Because do you exist? And are you just matter? Because if you are, and you're a materialist, then you would think that you still exist after you die, but before you decompose. But you don't. You think that you are gone because you know from firsthand experience that there is more to existence than just matter. All right. Thank you, guys. Please hit the like button. Okay, I did not mean to appear to reject idealism. I don't reject it. It's part of sentient singularity theory that we are inside of mind, and that the ideas or thoughts of that mind appear to us as materialism. So they're just two sides of one coin, and I reject both of the words as fundamental frameworks of or descriptions of reality. Like, I don't think idealism is an accurate way to describe fundamental reality. I don't think materialism is either. But I do think that idealism and materialism are good ways to describe like non-fundamental reality. But anyways, please hit the like button, guys. It helps boost the algorithm. I know that this, I feel like the stream got started a bit slow, but it was different than we normally do. I normally do not criticize much. I do recommend watching their entire discussion, though, that we talked about tonight. It is linked down below. But this, and like I said, I try not to be too critical, but this one I could not be, and I think that it was a good conversation, though, to highlight, because it's not a matter of being critical of these people. There is a mindset that was very apparent throughout this entire interview that Brian did, and it is a cornerstone part of the problem that is holding physics back. And I felt like it was important to show. Hopefully it came across and you found value in it. That makes sense. Appreciate the clarification. Always try and make me clarify if I'm not clear. I want to be clear. So I appreciate you like challenging how I was speaking, Mike. But with that, I will be back next week on Tuesday. Also, if you would like to join our Discord, please send me a private message on Instagram. We have live calls, open calls every Thursday evenings. And you can ask me questions about anything, talk to me about anything. It's not recorded. And it's just a voice call. You can also just listen. We have channels in our Discord community for all different topics. And but like I said, if you would like to join, send me a private message and ask me for the link. The link to my Instagram is below. It can be either Theory of Everyone or Tyler Marshall Goldstein. Also, please sign up for my email list on sentientsingularity.com. I will not spam you, but when we start talking about morality, after the paper gets published, there is a strong chance that this channel could eventually be censored by YouTube, which everything that is more controversial than keeping a goldfish, even keeping a goldfish, will eventually be censored by YouTube, as crazy as that sounds. But with that, take care, guys. Peace.